thank you for having me. This is actually, as I was just telling Mike, this is my introduction to North Star Reach. I was not familiar with the organization before. This is also my first time presenting on this particular topic. Grief is a huge part of the work I do in palliative care. I work at St. Joe's Hospital in Ann Arbor. And so I'm very familiar with grief of all kinds, and anticipatory grief in particular, I would say, because the people that I work with are generally either just being diagnosed with a serious illness, learning that, their illness isn't curable, preparing for the end of life. So a lot of work on anticipatory grief with patients and caregivers. So I'm going to just start by defining grief. I think this conference, when I was invited to speak here, was presented to me as sort of a bereavement conference. And the terms bereavement and grief are used interchangeably a lot, but they really are different things. Bereavement is the state of loss, whereas grief is really the reaction to the state of loss. Grief, the response to loss, particularly to the loss of someone or some living thing that has died, to which a bond or affection was formed. Although conventionally focused on the emotional response to loss, we think of grief as an emotional response. There are all kinds of physical, cognitive, behavioral, social, cultural, spiritual, and philosophical dimensions. Obviously, a lot more than we can get into in a lot of depth here today, but I want to invite, as Mike mentioned, people to ask questions or offer comments during the presentation. I know that there's a lot of wisdom in this virtual room beyond what I have to offer. And so I'd like for us to be able to benefit from sharing and hearing from each other. So please don't be shy about doing that. The objectives of the presentation today are first, to be able to define anticipatory grief and the situations that often trigger it, identify the potential purpose or benefits of anticipatory grief, how it differs from conventional grief, and discuss some resources and approaches to addressing anticipatory grief to enhance coping, and to discuss how to live with anticipatory grief without overshadowing the experience of being with a loved one prior to death. And especially later in the presentation, I'm hoping to look to some of you to hear about your experiences and your, tips for ways to cope with and manage anticipatory grief for those of you who are experiencing it or have experienced it before. So in terms of defining it, anticipatory grief is just what it sounds like, grief in anticipation of something. And typically when we talk about anticipation, it's something we usually associate with something positive, something we're looking forward to. I'm probably older than a lot of you in the room, but I'm a huge fan of the Carly Simon song, Anticipation. That's a perfect example. If you aren't familiar with that song, I encourage you to go and listen to it. And even if you are familiar with it, go back and listen to it and listen to the lyrics. Look up the lyrics online. I think they're phenomenal when it comes to both positive anticipation, but also situations like this one, like we're talking about when someone is grieving in anticipation of a loss. So, in the case of an impending loss, anticipation, it's hard to keep saying anticipatory, so bear with me. But anticipation brings emotions like sadness, anxiety, anger, guilt, fear. Guilt is a big one that we're going to talk about more later. And These are normal emotions, obviously, that go with any sort of grief, including in anticipation of loss. But they're normal as long as they don't prevent us from living in the moment, from being a part of the experiences of caring for a loved one, of being present with a loved one when they're dying. And this is really the hard part. How do you live with that anticipation of loss, with the grief that comes with the anticipation, but not miss out on the time and the experiences that we have with the loved ones that we know we're going to lose? Mindfulness is something that I think a lot of us struggle with these days. And it ultimately, in my mind, comes down to that. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So, the origin of anticipatory grief was kind of interesting for me to look into. It's a concept that was first described by a psychiatrist named Eric Lindemann during World War II. And he was looking at this phenomenon of um, spouses of soldiers that were rejecting their husbands upon return from war. And, he developed this idea that they had naturally just sort of anticipated that their husbands would not be returning from war, and developed just this grief response and separation. And when that didn't come about, that separation led them to reject their husbands when they came back from war. There was some connection of that with Freud's grief work theory. Um, and there's some, um, you know, controversy, I think, surrounding that, as well as there is around most of what Freud had to say. But just that idea that they had to detach emotionally to prepare themselves for what they expected out of the war, was interesting, and I think translates well into a lot of the situations that those of us in the room are dealing with. Um, Starting in the 70s, it was described more in terms of a forewarning of death. And so it started to be looked at in situations where people had a loved one with a chronic illness, a serious illness, and they were anticipating death, versus what happens to people when they lose a loved one suddenly. Um, and since the 90s, most of the studies have been focused more on um, the emotional and psychological reactions to expected loss, and not so much on the circumstances of the loss. Are we talking about the loss of someone with serious illness, or a sudden loss, or war, that kind of thing? It is anticipatory grief, just the concept itself actually is somewhat controversial, which was a surprise to me as well when I started looking at the literature. Um, because a number of studies have shown, um, well, there are some conflicting outcomes in studies, and I'll talk a little bit more about um, some of the surprising things that some studies I read have found, but that anticipatory grief and signs of the psychological and emotional reactions that we call anticipatory grief, a lot of studies have shown actually indicate greater risk for complicated grief after the loss, which was surprising to me. But that's where some of the controversy lies, I think. So I think it kind of goes without saying, anticipation, and I'm going to keep doing that. Anticipation of a loved one's death can lead to psychological distress, obviously. And this, I just mentioned that some studies have shown that it can be an indicator of high risk for complicated grief during the bereavement period. And I think my own thoughts about that have a lot to do with that concern about living in the moment. I think the more that we are kind of enveloped in this grief response while our loved one is still with us, um, the less mindful we're able to be, and the more likely we are to miss out on some things, um, which then after our loved one is gone, um, can bring about some regret, some grief. Um, I'm going to be using the term caregiver on and off throughout the presentation, for lack of a better term to kind of include everyone that we're talking about here. So there is a difference between anticipatory grief and being prepared for the death of a loved one. You know, being prepared, preparedness for an anticipated death, has some practical elements as well as emotional elements. And there's really more literature and more study out there about preparedness for loss, preparedness for death. Longer caregiving periods often result in greater preparedness, both practical preparedness and emotional. I think likely because there's more time that's available to engage in the things that need to be taken care of prior to someone's death. Lower preparedness has been shown to correlate with complicated bereavement, especially in younger caregivers, primarily spouses. Higher preparedness associated with greater feelings of reward from caregiving. You know, I've experienced a number of personal losses myself, and mine have all been anticipated, you know, opportunities for me to sort of prepare myself emotionally, mostly. And I think that I have probably experienced some of that anticipatory grief. I think a lot of times it comes with the initial, whether it's initial diagnosis or that time when you become aware of the fact that this person is not going to survive. I think there's some anticipatory grief in that initial phase that can subside over time if you're able to focus yourself on living mindfully and being present so that you're there for that time that you have with your loved one. I've known people in my life who have had sudden losses, not had that opportunity to prepare. And my perception is that that's more difficult emotionally, because there is not the opportunity to seek some resolution, some comfort in the presence of the individual that you are losing, as there is when you have the opportunity to prepare for the loss. And I did not get into a lot of research about that in particular. Whether my perception of it is consistent with research, I don't know. And maybe there's someone in the room who does have some knowledge about that. I would encourage you to speak up if you do. So practical preparedness, I think, just as it sounds, is really about having things in order. And I think it's easy to think of that as not being as important as the emotional preparedness, but not being prepared in a practical way for a loved one's loss, especially a spouse, I think, can contribute to complicated bereavement. Um, and so doing things like getting financial affairs in order, um, making sure that the caregiver's name is on the accounts and things like that. Where do I find the passwords to be able to pay the bills? Um, I've known people who knew for years that they were not going to survive their illness, who never took care of those practical things, and I've watched the distress that that caused the spouse afterwards. And so the practical preparedness really is important in the whole grieving and bereavement process. Um, the comprehensive medical knowledge or understanding of the loved one's illness is another piece of that practical preparedness, as I see it. Understanding what is happening physically and what you can expect physically, understanding what you see in that person's decline is an important part of being prepared for that process of death. Arrangements for the care of surviving children or surviving parents is an important part of the practical preparedness. I think, especially for the individual who's dying, um, to have that kind of resolution and that peace. And then awareness of next steps, things that will be expected of the caregiver, the surviving loved ones after death. Things like funeral arrangements and how many death certificates do I need and who do I need to call to notify about this? Do I have to call Social Security? Again, those are things that sound small, that sound petty on the surface in comparison to the emotional impact of loss, but they're really important. And they're questions that I face every single day, that loved ones go straight from what can I expect when we remove the ventilator and I watch my father die to what is going to be expected of me after that? What do I have to do? What happens to his body? What paperwork do I have to sign? So all of that is part of this same process, as different as it seems from each other. So being prepared emotionally, I think also includes medical knowledge, as I was describing. Understanding what's happening to the loved one's body is also part of being prepared emotionally for what you will see and what you will deal with in providing care to a dying loved one. And certainly, resolution of conflicts or um, things that you haven't said that you've been meaning to say to someone, or um, relationships that need to be mended. I think part of emotional preparedness too is having some kind of vision or thoughts about what life might look like after a loved one's death. I think it's easy for people, especially partners, spouses, to feel some guilt about having those kinds of feelings and thoughts and visions of what that might be like after the loved one's death, but it's part of preparedness. And some of that preparedness, I think, can help people um, to not have as much of the anticipatory grief, if that makes sense. Um, being prepared can help prevent some of that. And it can be as simple as a caregiver's perception of his or her readiness for the loved one's death. Preparedness and readiness are different, but both important, and having some degree of readiness for a loved one's death is part of being prepared, part of the grief process. So some of the things that are challenging about anticipatory grief that people can struggle with, it can be isolating, because a lot of people find it socially unacceptable to admit that they're having grief in response to an expected loss of a loved one. I think, sometimes people feel like grieving the anticipated loss is giving up hope. That, when someone is diagnosed with a serious illness and you spend all this time and energy focused on treating and getting better and hoping for and expecting recovery, that when people start to admit to having some grief response as they see their loved one declining, that it can be, it can bring about some shame, some guilt in feeling like if I admit to grief, I'm giving up hope. And that's not accurate. That's something that people in my position have to really help caregivers to feel okay about. You can carry both. It can be very difficult to find the support and help with coping that you need when you're having anticipatory grief. There are not a lot of online resources about it. Support groups are generally focused on, losses or on patients who are hoping to get better and their loved ones, or grief after the loss of a loved one. You would be hard pressed to find a support group for people who are grieving the expected loss of a loved one. There are some support groups in the oncology world for people with metastatic cancers. I don't believe we have one here, but a lot of institutions do offer metastatic cancer support groups. And that's a place where I think some of this can be addressed and provides a good opportunity for maybe having a satellite group for the partners or the loved ones of the people in that group to talk about what it's like knowing that their loved one is not going to survive their illness and dealing with the grief at the same time that they're trying to be supportive and hopeful. But I just don't think there's a lot of it out there. So that's one of the things that makes it pretty isolating. There is an article on the reference page at the end of this presentation, and you can take a screenshot of it, or I can certainly send it to Mike as well. But a very, very good article that I read that I got some references out of for this that I think helps with providing kind of a design for what anticipatory grief looks like, what it does for you, how to get through it, a framework for it that could be helpful, I think, for people dealing with it. So unlike the stages of grief that we commonly talk about following a death, even though I think any of us who work in the field of grief or bereavement understand that the stages are not stages that people fall into in order, but they are stages that people go in and out of. There's not really a formula or a set of stages or expected phases of anticipatory grief, not that I've been able to find. And as I said earlier, it can come with a lot of guilt because people feel like they are giving up hope if they acknowledge grief over a loss that they're expecting. And this is something that in palliative care we deal with a lot. So what does anticipatory grief do for me? What could be the purpose of it? It can provide an opportunity for closure, for resolving conflicts, for saying goodbye, both for the caregiver and for the loved one who's dying. It can help caregivers find some meaning in their experience of the process of losing their loved one. It does not prevent grief after death. It doesn't shorten the bereavement period after death either. How it is different from conventional grief. It can be more complex because it can be challenging to identify exactly what it is you're grieving. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the specifics of how it's different. But, you know, a lot of what people are grieving is roles, is relationships. When the person that you're grieving is still there with you, what you're really grieving is losing pieces of them, losing connections with them, losing things that you are to each other. And while that's certainly part of bereavement, it's really everything. When you're talking about anticipatory grief, and that's what makes it different from conventional grief. That's what CG means, by the way. I didn't specify that, conventional grief. It can involve more anger and loss of emotional control and emotional dysregulation. And always that challenge of trying to balance maintaining hope versus letting go. I found this website, which is really nice. It's kind of, this comes from a blog. This 31 Days with Grief is like a grief blog, hospicewhispers.com. I really like it, so I encourage you to look that up. But sometimes it isn't just the primary loss we're grieving, but all the secondary losses of hopes, dreams, identity, connection, and security that we must mourn and try to heal. And that certainly describes a lot of what we're talking about. So some of the symptoms of anticipatory grief, and I think in terms of calling them symptoms, I would say that these are some ways that maybe we might differentiate between anticipatory grief and preparedness for death, emotional preparedness. With anticipatory grief, there's a sadness, obviously, frequent crying, again, that emotional dysregulation, having trouble controlling, regulating emotions, a lot of fear and anxiety, irritability or anger, loneliness, and this idea of being incredibly lonely when you're not alone. Your loved one is still with you and you feel lonely. There can be a real urgency to want to talk through things. And as I've mentioned before, guilt. There's survivor guilt, and there's the guilt of feeling like you're grieving someone who's still there, and that means that you're giving up hope or that you've let go of them before they've gone. And then there is oftentimes rehearsal of the anticipated death, how that might look, how that might go, what it's going to feel like, in addition to just envisioning what life might be like after the loss. I think that's different from rehearsing the death. Some of the physical and psychological symptoms that can come with anticipatory grief and the distress that it causes. Insomnia or sleep disturbance, weight loss, difficulty having an appetite, muscle tension, tremulousness related to heightened anxiety. Social isolation is certainly a big one. Not exactly a symptom, a physical symptom, but um, certainly a big problem for people, especially who are caregiving and are experiencing anticipatory grief. Um, Impatience, irritability. And again, the impatience, the irritability, the anxiety sometimes can be directed at the loved one. And with that, then can come guilt that I'm being impatient with my loved one who can't help the fact that they can't get out of the chair by themselves or go to the bathroom by themselves. And it's not their fault, but the isolation and the loneliness um, can lead someone to be irritable. Some other interesting things to think about with anticipatory grief is that the character of it can be very different depending on the type of illness or death that we're looking at. Most research that I found is really focused on the loss of a parent from dementia, which is certainly a common um, situation where anticipatory grief and or preparedness is common. But death from cancer, for example, is very different. You know, when someone is dying of dementia, it is generally, other than a couple of situations, a couple types of dementia that aren't quite as common, but let's say Alzheimer's, is more of a fairly steady progressive decline. And sometimes it's fast and sometimes it's over years, but it's a fairly gradual decline. Whereas death from cancer comes with often more sudden or rapid declines than something like dementia. It can also involve death from cancer can also involve a lot of really difficult or even traumatic images. The kind of what we call cachexia in medicine, the real wasting, muscle wasting that people go through when they die from cancer is traumatic for loved ones to witness. The sickness that can come with the disease or with the treatments, the nausea and vomiting and the hair loss and some of those visual images can really heighten the distress of the caregiver. And all of this contributes to development of that anticipatory grief response. And the degree of uncertainty associated with a decline makes a difference. And the distress that comes with anticipatory grief is largely from the collision of the loss of current roles with the anticipated loss of the individual. And the amount of caregiving that somebody requires. Oftentimes, if someone is caregiving for a parent with dementia, they require a lot of physical care as they get closer to the end of life. And that can have a lot of impact on the grief that people experience while their loved one is still alive. Watching someone suffer, it brings suffering of its own to the caregiver, obviously. Just like I was just talking about when people are dying of cancer, and there are visual images that are traumatic, that are difficult, that that show us suffering, that our loved one is suffering, is traumatic and can cause suffering in the caregiver both before and after death. And as that suffering increases, as the disease progresses, caregivers can feel more and more helpless because there's only so much that they can do to comfort, to relieve that distress and that suffering. So some of the things that make it a problem, I guess, is the disruption that it can bring in someone's own life, having to take time off work, not being able to socialize. Sometimes it can interfere with the primary relationship in your life. And oftentimes the outlets that you normally would use for coping aren't available to you. Maybe you don't have the time available to go out and do the things that you normally do to let off steam, going for a run or going out with your friends. The person that you turn to talk about things that are difficult may be the person that you're losing. And that can also make it difficult to find a place to deal with the grief that you're feeling. And that lack of reciprocity in that relationship can really lead to ambivalence toward that person. You're no longer getting the support and the love that you had always counted on from them. And all of these feelings that people have in response to this loss of relationship can then lead people to feel guilty about having those feelings. And again, what's most important, I think, is helping people to understand how normal that is. A caregiver must constantly be balancing, holding on and letting go, managing the threat to a loved one's life versus finding acceptance that it will eventually prevail, waiting for the next thing that's going to happen, but always trying to maintain hope, seeking comfort from the attachment to the loved one, but trying to release that attachment at the same time. And ultimately, the conflict of wanting to keep that person around, but at some point also being ready for it to be over. That's a source of a lot of distress and a lot of guilt that leads to anticipatory grief. I'm sorry, my phone is vibrating. Making a lot of noise. I forgot to turn it off. So what I would like to get to, and hopefully to hear from some of you as well, is how do we address this challenge of anticipatory grief and all of these inherent, conflicts, dichotomies of caregiving at the end of life and dealing with anticipatory grief. And again, from this blog, this quote, living under the constant threat of tomorrow's loss can rob us of our todays if we are not mindful. And to me, that's exactly what we're talking about, is mindfulness. That's, in my mind, the number one strategy that is likely to be successful in addressing the challenge of anticipatory grief, because that's what keeps us in the moment and recognizing the limitations on what we can do to make things better, to care for our loved one, to make this process as comfortable for them as possible. There are limitations on that, but what we have is time with them and an opportunity to find meaning in that process. And so I think we start by accepting that it's stressful to care for someone at the end of life. Even just to be present with someone important in your life who is going through that decline toward the end of life, and reduce the emotional demands, the expectations that you have of yourself during this process, and be okay with the crying periods or the need to get away and do something meaningful, taking a walk or visiting a friend or something, to get away from that situation and not feel guilty about that. understand that grief is an oscillating process before and after death. I got that term from one of the articles I'll reference at the end, and I really like that image. I'd not heard it explained that way before, but it certainly is. You know, grief is this process of, I picture the fan oscillating between, you know, sadness and acceptance and hope, and, you know, um, being present for the loved one that needs support, that is dying, but then also, you know, trying to get back to living life and appreciating the joy that you do have in your life, and not feeling bad about being in either one of those places at any given time. These are normal, natural, adaptive responses to a difficult, stressful situation, and there's no getting around that. And there are a lot of, you know, through the whole COVID crisis, mindfulness has been a big focus for trying to help healthcare workers to get through the stress of having to work and care for patients through this whole thing. And so there's a lot out there right now on mindfulness, a lot of meditation apps out there that I actually think are really helpful. And I should have put some on a slide and I didn't think of it, but there are some apps that I would suggest you look into if mindfulness is something that you're interested in learning to practice more. Headspace is one that I've used quite a bit. And there's one called Calm. And if there are others, you know, in a few minutes, we'll sort of open up for discussion, and maybe others have ones that they would suggest as well. But I think, you know, adapting to the reality that death can occur at any moment, which is of course true for all of us, is an important part of coping with it, and seeking support when you need it. So these are the references, and I would encourage you to take a screenshot. The last one, that Understanding Anticipatory Grief, is like a handout that someone gave me. And if it's something that you're interested in, I would invite you to email me, maybe through the camp, the organization, and I can share it with you. But the one that I was talking about that I think really provides a nice framework that can also be useful for lay people is the first one there, a conceptual family caregivers anticipatory grief, a conceptual framework for understanding its multiple challenges. I think it's an outstanding article, so I encourage you to look at it. So I would like to hear from you at this point. What has worked for you?
Are you just wanting people to speak out?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll be the first then. I know it takes somebody to start it. So
that's right. Thank you.
Thank you for preparing this this talk with a lot of helpful information. I'm a professional person as well, attending as a professional. And I just wanted to acknowledge mindfulness is something that has been, I mean, more than a buzzword, but one of those things that we have heard far more about in the last couple of years than previously. And I just really appreciated and liked how you really brought that into these end of life situations where we can use mindfulness in a way to really help support and provide some guidance to family members and other important people to really be in those moments as well, to be able to support them experiencing, not only being present, but really experiencing what those moments have to offer for them to carry on throughout their lifetime. And without being able to do that, how there can be that continued complicated grief following if they haven't been able to really soak in what those moments can offer. So I just really wanted to acknowledge that. I appreciated you really emphasizing that.
Hmm,
Thanks.
thank you. I had a conversation with a patient recently who had had cancer for some time, but had just reached a point where there was no more treatment available for her. And so she was kind of making that transition in her mind from treatment to preparing for the end of her life. And she was not very old, and was really pretty depressed. And when I sat down and talked with her, what came out was all this anxiety about her farm and selling her farm and how to disperse all of her assets, and what about my 90-year-old mother and making sure that she's taking care of it, all these different things that she was worried about getting wrapped up, like not having enough time for it. And we spent a little time just talking about, you don't have to worry about all those things right now. Start with what step are we going to take tomorrow, and we're going to get you home tomorrow, and we're going to have a hospice team meet you there, and they're going to have a social worker for you to talk to, um, and they'll help you kind of make a list of things that you need to deal with, and you just start with one. And you know what, if you don't get to some of those things on the list, they're going to take care of themselves. That's what happens. You don't take care of it, somebody does. If you die and your house is still full of a lot of stuff that you didn't get rid of, somebody will take care of that. And I went back to see her later in the day because she was leaving the same day, and I brought her some information, and she was like a different person. It was just like this weight had been lifted off her, and she just said, God, you're right. I don't have to deal with all that right now. It's amazing what just focusing on the moment and trying to erase all that extra stuff that you can't do anything about in this moment does for someone's emotional state and ability to cope. It was something to see.
Beautifully said. I mean, way to put the bow on the entire presentation there, Jennifer. I know we have about 15 seconds left. Just wanted to let
Oh,
everybody know that there's a survey that's going to be sent out after the conference, so feel free to fill that out. And thank you, Jennifer, for a wonderful, wonderful presentation.
oh, thank you. My pleasure.